When every door in front of you seems to close, remember there is one door that never shuts, the door to God. Have you ever had days when it feels like the whole world is against you? When someone's words cut deeper than a knife? When your work suddenly feels meaningless? When you feel lost in the noise of life? In those moments, Psalm 120 rises like a cry from the deepest parts of the soul. In my distress, I called to the Lord, and he answered me. This is not just the cry of one suffering man, it is the voice of all humanity. It is the voice of those who wrestle between truth and deception, between faith and fear, between hope and despair. Psalm 120 begins with a desperate cry, not a demand for wealth or success, but a plea born from a wounded heart. The psalmist cries out because he is surrounded by lies and deceitful tongues. And perhaps, just like him, you too have reached a breaking point. Maybe someone betrayed your trust. Maybe you're exhausted by words that cut your spirit. But right there, in the pain, God is not far away. He is listening. He does not need polished prayers, he longs for honest hearts. Because Psalm 120 teaches us this powerful truth. God does not need your perfection. He desires your sincerity. When you call upon him, the miracle may not always be that he changes your situation, but that he changes you. He turns fear into peace, tears into strength, despair into faith. You begin to realize that God never promised an easy path, but he did promise his presence. Take a moment now, breathe. Every breath you take is proof that God is near. He is waiting for your call. Whisper, Lord, save me. Even a trembling voice reaches heaven, because one sincere prayer can change everything. When you call on God, he doesn't just hear with his ears, he listens with his heart. And sometimes his answer doesn't come through a voice, but through an unexplainable peace settling deep within your soul. That peace is proof that he has already heard you. If you feel that peace, write a simple comment. I believe God hears me. Sometimes. That small act of faith can awaken hope in someone else watching this video, someone who needs to know they're not alone. Psalm 120 is more than a lament, it's a journey that begins in sorrow but ends in faith. Every verse is a reminder. When you call to me, I will answer you. So don't wait until you've run out of strength to call upon the Lord. Call upon him today, right now, because the moment you speak to God, he begins to move on your behalf. When light fades, he is the last light that remains. When the world falls silent, his voice still whispers. And when you fall to your knees, God will lift you up, not to erase the pain, but to help you understand its purpose. Psalm 120 begins with a cry, but that cry reaches heaven itself. Because when a heart cries out in truth, all of heaven listens. You are not alone. Even if people abandon you, even if the world turns its back, God's eyes are still upon you, waiting for you to call his name. Today, don't let your pain silence you. Cry out to the Lord, for the very moment you do, you will see miracles begin the moment you whisper, Lord, help me. There is a hidden power in Psalm 120 that many overlook. The power of an honest cry. The psalmist doesn't try to appear strong or composed. He doesn't hide his pain. He openly admits, deliver me, O Lord, from lying lips and from a deceitful tongue. In that raw confession, he discovers something extraordinary. God does not come to those who pretend to be perfect. He comes to those who are real. We live in a world that constantly tells us to be strong, to stay in control, to always say I'm fine. But Psalm 120 teaches the opposite. When you are weak, don't hide. Cry out to God. Because when you admit you can't do it alone, you open the door for God to move. Have you ever realized that the most powerful prayers are often the shortest ones? Sometimes it's just a trembling whisper, Lord, help me. Those words reach heaven because they come straight from the core of your soul, honest, desperate, and true. The psalmist says he lives among those who hate peace. He is tired of deceit, surrounded by conflict and falsehood. But instead of fighting back with anger, he chooses prayer. That's the wisdom of Psalm 120. When the world pushes you to shout, God invites you to kneel. Maybe today, you're living in your own Meshech or Kedar, places that, in the Bible, represent hostility and isolation. You might feel like a stranger in your own life, lost in a world that doesn't understand you. But remember this, Meshech is only a stop, not your destination. God is still guiding you, and when you call on Him, He whispers to your heart, you are never alone. One beautiful thing about Psalm 120 is that it doesn't end in bitterness. It ends with a spark of hope. After all the deceit and confusion, the psalmist finds one unshakable truth. God is the only place where truth still lives. This psalm becomes a gentle invitation to you. Stop listening to the noise of the world and start listening to the voice of God within. Maybe you've prayed before and felt like God was silent. But silence doesn't mean absence. Sometimes God's silence is His way of working behind the scenes. Think of a teacher who stays quiet during a test, not because he has abandoned the student, but because he trusts them to grow. If you're in a season of silence right now, know this: God is building faith in you, not forgetting you. Right now, I want you to pause for just a moment. Think of one thing that weighs heavily on your heart. Don't overthink it. Just one thing. Then, write it in the comments below this video. It could be as simple as, I'm calling on God. Because sometimes, when you take that small step of faith, when you dare to write it out, you're already stepping closer to your breakthrough. And who knows, your simple comment might inspire someone else watching to call upon God too. Psalm 120 reminds us that faith doesn't mean being fearless. It means believing through the fear. The psalmist didn't wait until he was calm or confident to pray. He prayed while he was afraid. That's what made his prayer powerful. If you're weary from lies, from people who misunderstand you, from battles that seem unfair, do what the psalmist did. Don't fight back with anger. Cry out to God instead. He will not leave you to fight alone. When you cry out, God doesn't just listen, He acts. You might not see it right away, but heaven starts to move the moment your prayer leaves your lips. And one day, you'll look back and say, if I hadn't prayed that day, I would have missed this miracle. Psalm 120 teaches that every prayer, even the smallest one, is like an arrow shot toward heaven, and no arrow of faith ever falls to the ground. God hears every sigh, every tear, every whispered prayer, and He will turn them all into a beautiful answer of grace. So hold on to that truth, because in the next part, we will discover how God answers the cries of His people. Not always the way we expect, but always better than we imagine. When we read Psalm 120 carefully, we realize it's not just a lament. It's a cry that marks the beginning of a journey of faith. The psalmist doesn't stop at his pain. He moves forward into the presence of God. And that's exactly what God wants us to do. Don't stop at the cry, step into trust. Many people pray and expect an instant miracle. They want to see immediate results, to hear God's voice, to feel something change. But Psalm 120 reminds us that faith is not about seeing. It's about believing even when nothing seems to change. The psalmist doesn't describe a dramatic turnaround. He simply says, the Lord answered me. Just that, short, simple, but powerful. It's a declaration of trust. He doesn't need visible proof because he knows that if God has heard, then God will act. In your own life, there will be times when you pray and feel like nothing happens. You will ask, Lord, do you hear me? But Psalm 120 teaches us that God's silence is not His absence. It's the testing ground of faith. He wants you to trust His heart more than your emotions. Feelings change from day to day, but God never changes. When you continue praying through silence, you are planting seeds of faith. and one day they will bloom in ways you never expected. Imagine the psalmist's world, surrounded by lies, hostility, and false voices. Every day he hears words that twist the truth and tear at his soul. Yet instead of responding with anger, he chooses to stay silent and pray. That's the strength of those who belong to God, the power to remain calm in the storm. He knows that revenge never brings peace. Only God brings true justice. Maybe you're living through your own night, season. Maybe you've been misunderstood, slandered, or betrayed by someone you trusted. But remember this: God never sleeps on your pain. He sees, he hears, and he will respond. Not when you want, but when you need it most. Sometimes God doesn't rescue you from the fire, but he walks with you through the fire. And in that fire, you'll discover something miraculous. You're no longer afraid, because you realize you are never alone. Psalm 120 speaks deeply about truth and deceit. The psalmist suffers because he lives among deceitful tongues, but he refuses to let lies define him. He lets God define who he is. Likewise, today's world is filled with voices that try to make you doubt yourself. You are not good enough. God doesn't care about you. But remember, those are not the words of your Creator. God never accuses, he affirms. He doesn't condemn, he calls you his own. So whenever you hear lies trying to drown out your faith, respond with prayer. Lord, show me your truth, not the lies of this world. There's incredible power in choosing to pray instead of reacting. When others gossip, you pray. When others hate, you forgive. When others blame, you trust. That's when God starts working, not only around you, but within you. You become stronger, calmer, and no longer easily shaken by the chaos of the world. Because true peace doesn't come from the world. It comes from the one who created it. If you are walking through darkness right now, remember, God never promised to remove every pain, but he promised to turn every pain into purpose. And often, his greatest miracle is not changing your circumstances. It's changing you within them. When you pray, the skies may not open, but your heart will. And when your heart opens, the light of God enters. Psalm 120 ends quietly but profoundly. The psalmist is still surrounded by enemies, still living in a place of tension, but he is no longer afraid. He has found peace, because even though lies remain, God's truth still wins. And perhaps that is the real miracle, the miracle of peace in the middle of the storm. So if you're standing in the storm today, don't run, don't despair. Stand firm and call upon the Lord. Let him prove that. He is not only the one who listens, he is the one who moves. And when he moves, you'll see that every tear, every prayer, every sigh had meaning. No cry goes unheard in heaven. Let Psalm 120 become your prayer today. In my distress, I called to the Lord, and he answered me. Because when you say that with all your heart, heaven begins to move, and the peace of God will dwell within you. Have you ever felt far from God, like the psalmist in Psalm 120, who cries out, "Woe to me that I dwell in Meshech, that I live among the tents of Kedar." These aren't just distant lands. They represent a state of the soul, a place of alienation, loneliness, and spiritual fatigue where the heart feels isolated and unseen. Psalm 120 marks the beginning of the Songs of Ascents, a series of psalms describing the journey back to God, and that journey always begins with pain. You cannot truly seek God until you first felt how empty life is without him. Just like the prodigal son, only when we reach the bottom of our brokenness do we begin to long for home. If you're living in your own Meshech, surrounded by noise, pressure, and deceit, Psalm 120 is your invitation. Don't hide. Don't try to survive on your own. Cry out to God. Let him know that you're tired, frustrated, and running out of strength. God doesn't wait for a perfect prayers. He listens to honest cries from weary hearts. When you pray, your situation might not change immediately, but something begins to move within you. Your soul stirs. You start to realize that you are not alone. You are still loved, still seen, and still heard by the one who holds the universe. That's the miracle of faith. When nothing changes, yet everything within you begins to shift. The psalmist says he lives among those who hate peace. That sounds painfully familiar today. We live in a world quick to anger, eager to criticize, and slow to forgive. In such a place, seeking peace often feels like swimming against the current. But true faith is not built on noise or aggression. It is built on the peace that comes from God. The kind of peace the world cannot give. When you choose to pray instead of react, to stay silent instead of argue, to forgive instead of retaliate, that's when God begins to move through you. The world may see it as weakness, but heaven calls it strength, because you have chosen divine power over human pride. Psalm 120 reminds us of this truth. God doesn't just hear your cry. He steps into it. He's not a distant observer watching from the sky. He's a father who sits beside you, holding your heart as it trembles. Every tear, every whisper, every sigh matters to him, and in his presence, your wounds begin to heal. Your chains begin to break, and a new light dawns inside you. When you pray, the world around you may still be chaotic, but inside, peace begins to bloom. That's the quiet miracle Psalm 120 reveals. Not a miracle of changed circumstances, but a miracle of transformation. Sometimes God doesn't calm the storm outside you. He calms the storm within you. Imagine if the psalmist never prayed. He would have drowned in bitterness, anger, and despair. But through his cry to God, he discovered hope. The hope that even in exile, God was guiding him home. That single sentence, "I called upon the Lord," marked the turning point. The first step of redemption, the first moment of ascent. Psalm 120 doesn't end with a dramatic victory. It ends with a changed heart. And sometimes that's the greatest miracle of all. Not when God moves mountains, but when he moves a soul. When he turns confusion into peace, weakness into strength, and loneliness into love. If today you feel weary, if you are trapped in your own meshik or kida, remember this. One prayer can open the heavens. Begin like the psalmist. "I called to the Lord in my distress, and he answered me." Because when you call upon him, you're not just speaking your pain. You're opening your life to grace. And from that moment, your journey is no longer a lonely one. It becomes the road home, the road where God walks beside you. There's something profoundly beautiful about Psalm 120 that many people overlook. It doesn't end with shouting or triumph, nor with a visible miracle or victory. It ends quietly, with faithful silence, a deep assurance that the Lord has heard me. That silence isn't empty. It's sacred. It's the space where pain meets peace, where fear is replaced by trust. Many of us live in that silence today, the space between praying and seeing the answer. But that is where God does his deepest work. He may not be changing your circumstances yet, but he is changing you. Psalm 120 marks the beginning of the songs of ascents, the pilgrimage toward God's presence. And every pilgrimage begins with pain. Before we can sing about joy, we must first learn how to cry out in distress. Before our hearts can rise, they must first be broken open. The psalmist says, "I called to the Lord in my distress, and he answered me." That single line holds the entire story. He doesn't explain how God answered, because the greatest miracle wasn't an external rescue. It was the assurance that God was near. Maybe you're in that same place, praying but not seeing results, waiting without understanding. But remember, God never stays silent longer than he must. When you don't see his hand, trust his heart. When you don't understand his plan, trust his presence. When you feel like you can't go on, remember, He's already walking beside you. Faith is not an escape from pain. It's the courage to keep walking through it, knowing you are not alone. Our God doesn't stand far off, watching from a distance. He walks with us through every valley, every storm, every tear. He turns each sorrow into a seed of hope and transforms suffering into strength. Like the psalmist, we to live among those who hate peace. We are surrounded by noise, deceit, and division. Yet, as children of God, we are not called to blend into the darkness. We are called to shine within it. And that light doesn't come from willpower or pride. It comes from dwelling near to God. Prayer is not simply asking for what we want. Prayer is the moment when God reshapes our hearts. Every time you kneel, you declare, Lord, I cannot, but you can. And that surrender opens the door for peace, not because everything around you is fixed, but because you have placed everything into God's hands. Let the words of Psalm 120 become your own prayer today. Speak to God honestly. No perfect words needed. Lord, I'm tired. I'm hurting. I need you. He never turns away from a heart that speaks truth. Maybe you are in a season of waiting, wondering if God still remembers you. But waiting is not wasted. It is the season where God grows your faith, roots it deeper, and prepares you for what's ahead. One day you'll look back and realize every tear, every unanswered prayer, every sleepless night was part of a story of grace leading you closer to Him. That is the real miracle. Not that God changes everything around you, but that He changes the way you see everything. He teaches you to see the storm through His eyes, not as punishment, but as purpose, not as abandonment, but as invitation. If you're hearing this right now, maybe it's because God is whispering to your heart. Don't stay silent anymore. Call upon me, because when you call, heaven listens. When you cry, God moves. He may not answer how you expect, but He will always answer in the way that saves your soul. Psalm 120 doesn't end in despair. It ends in direction. It points toward hope, toward peace, toward the next step in the climb toward God. And perhaps today is that first step for you. If this message spoke to your heart, I invite you, subscribe to this channel so we can continue walking together through the Psalms, through the Word, and through the quiet miracles of faith. Because sometimes one simple prayer is enough to change everything.